Hello and welcome to our annual Women in Geothermal UK panel webinar. This year we're really excited to bring together such an expert panel for what's sure to be a really interesting discussion on how we can get geothermal energy on the government agenda. If you're not already a member of Women in Geothermal, please visit our website, womeningeothermal.org, to sign up for free, as well as finding us on LinkedIn at Women in Geothermal UK to stay up to date with our activities. We have some really exciting events coming up, including an in-person networking drinks after the UK Geothermal Symposium and our annual AGM in December. So please be sure to kind of keep an eye on our socials. Before we get started with the panel, just some housekeeping. Microphones and videos will remain on for the panel, and we will be taking some live Q&A questions at the end, which hopefully you'll have the ability to turn on and speak if you so wish. Brilliant. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our chair, Simran. Simran is one of our fantastic Wing Committee volunteers and has been instrumental in pulling together this year's monthly Wednesday with Wing webinars. She is an engineering geologist at Arup and has recently moved to Edinburgh. So without further ado, Simran, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. For a great introduction, and hello everyone to this panel. We're very lucky to have Dr. Marit Brommer, Jordan Weddepohl, and Poppy Airey discussing on our panel. So I just give a bit of an introduction to our panelists. So Marit is the CEO of the International Geothermal Association. She's had a long career in the oil industry, as well as now spearheading geothermal energy. And the next person we have speaking is Jordan Weddepohl, who is a chartered senior geologist at Arup, and is the head of the geothermal group in the Northwest and Yorkshire region. And he has much experience in geothermal aspects, including lithium brine mining. Lastly, we have Poppy Airey, who is a senior policy analyst at the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technologies, which is a very large trade association. Advising the government. So without further ado, I'd like to go into the questions. So these are just a few questions. And the first question I have is for Jordan. So Jordan, how does the stance of the UK government compare on geothermal compared to other UK energy technologies?
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. I'll start by focusing on power rather than heat. So recently I attended the Westminster Energy, Environment and Transport Forum for the Contract for Difference CFD scheme in the UK. Those unfamiliar, the CFD scheme is a contractual mechanism to kind of incentivise renewable energy project investment. In simple terms, it's basically the government sets a standard price for energy prices in pounds per megawatt hour over a 15-year period to provide some revenue guarantee for developers. What was strikingly apparent in that 5-hour event was the lack of geothermal mention. It came up once, and this is kind of understandable from a UK government's perspective, because they have made substantial commitments to decarbonisation and meeting their net zero goals. So there's pressure to massively upscale at pace the renewable sector. So with this in mind, there's obviously a strong focus on solar and offshore wind, and the UK has some of the best offshore wind resources in the world. So that kind of investment has increased at pace, and this rapid investment has led to driven innovation, has developed supply chains, and has ultimately reduced the levelized cost for that technology. I think for the offshore wind sector, costs have reduced from maybe I think in 2010 it was 140 pounds per megawatt hour, and in 2025 I think that's reducing to around about 44. Forecast to reduce about 44 pounds per megawatt hour. And the scale of capacity that they're installing as well for offshore wind is, I think currently it's around about 30 gigawatts, and they're looking to ramp that up by double, so to 60 gigawatts by 2030. And similarly, solar has seen big investment. As you're sure you've seen on trains, you see solar farms popping up all over the place. And again, this has been driven by innovation, investment, supply chain, and a reduction in costs. So the government has these readily available supply technologies, and they have to meet their short delivery targets. So that's why they're focusing so much on that. Comparably, the UK, is set to commission its first deep geothermal power plant, United Downs, which is targeting 3 megawatts of electricity. So this is a great step in the right direction. It's obviously substantially smaller capacity than the existing technologies. So it's not an immediate solution, but hopefully the governments will shift their mind to longer term goals and maybe the 2050 goals, and hopefully we'll get more investment in the sector. With regards to heating and cooling, obviously the heating and cooling sector has seen a similar decarbonisation push. Currently it's heated by gas boilers and cooled by chillers. And the government and industry have all made decarbonisation goals and targets. So there's an increasing push to decarbonise the heating and cooling sector. Namely, this is coming about through air source heat pumps, because they can provide heating and cooling and a low carbon. But geothermal obviously has a big potential to be a big player in this sector. And what we often see is the toss up between, do clients go down the air source heat pump route or the geothermal or ground source heat pump route? So yeah, whilst it's an exciting time, geothermal power and heat and cooling is a little bit behind the curve, but it has a lot of potential to really decarbonise the sector. So yeah, it should be a strong contender in the future, and it's up to us to kind of push that agenda forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan, for that summary of the UK government stance. In contrast to this, I wanted to get Marit's opinion on the global opinion of how geothermal energy can help us meet net zero goals.
Yeah, thanks, Simran, and very excited to be here. Thanks for organizing this as Wing, and I see some amazing attendees. So well done again for Wing to collecting all these participants online. Yeah, look, global, I think we are about to really spark some interest. And I'm not saying that because I'm biased. I'm obviously very biased towards geothermal. But I do say this with an eye on what I see happening from a global perspective, especially some pertinent government leaders who have expressed the will to decarbonize both. And as Jordan already quite nicely said, I mean, we have a huge opportunity, of course, for the power market, but maybe an even more humongous opportunity for the heating and cooling market. And it is exactly in those two, let's say, elements that I see an uptick for geothermal energy. On the other hand, and I don't want to ruin the whole exciting party here, on the other hand, I mean, we're still, of course, very small when it comes down to our presence, and small when it comes down to the megawatt electric. We have approximately 16.5 gigawatt electric installed capacity. And let's be honest, Jordan, very nice. UK is leading indeed in the wind game. And I bet on average, you commission these days 1 to 2 gigawatt projects offshore, right? And we're talking about a 120-year history in geothermal with an installed capacity of 16.3 gigawatt electric. I'll come to heating and cooling in a sec. And hence, for any government to be influenced in terms of deciding on what works best to allow geothermal happening in their respective jurisdictions, they will always look at numbers. And hence, our numbers are, relatively speaking, so small that we're often overlooked. Now, part of that overlooking is also a little bit our own, let's say, if I may say so, because I do think as geothermal, we are not loud enough and we're not ambitious enough in terms of where we want to go and where we are heading towards. And what I do see is that having now on board, let's say, leading governments such as the US, who has, with their IRA, so their Inflation Reduction Act, has really put geothermal on the forefront, with a state secretary who even says, I am obsessed with geothermal. That does help to influence policies and policy, let's say, incentives especially around power. But also, let's say, governments like in Indonesia with clear targets on getting out of coal, because that's a coal-based country. It does help to shape up, let's say, the incentives and the guarantees and all the risk assessments that we need to be mitigated for when we do some heavy exploration for geothermal. And the government, again, is instrumental in allowing big-term investment coming from industry. So the Asia Pacific with, let's say, Indonesia, the Philippines, but also New Zealand, who is going to add another 50 to 100 megawatt on yearly basis in the coming, let's say, decade, is going to play a phenomenal role. Now, heating and cooling, I see two distinct, let's say, differences. I see China, who has embarked on a journey to really get out of coal in their inner city, let's say, district heating systems that are heating up and cooling down to some extent their inner cities. And hence, that's a bold policy decision to breathe clean air, right? That's what they wanted to achieve for the citizens. And if I see their growth curve with 20 to 30% as a growth curve for geothermal heating in the past 5 to 10 years, that's a phenomenal achievement that no other government or country is doing at this stage. Now, if you look at the EU, and especially, let's say, under the Green Deal and under their commitment to decarbonize both industry and cities, again, there could be a phenomenal role for geothermal to play into the ears of the high-level policies and hence, let's say, policy making leadership. And what I see is happening in the EU is that from us, as in the ones who are believing in geothermal from a subsurface point of view, I think we have the right ingredients to tell the policymakers how it works. What I still see is where we are lacking is to tell the story about how we fit in an infrastructure decision-making process. And hence, what you see is that we have to phase out a fossil fuel dominance when it comes down to heating and cooling, because let's be honest, 80 to 90% of our heating and cooling system in the EU is fed through a fossil fuel system, whether that's oil, gas, and in certain EU countries as well, coal. And hence that distribution and getting to the front door of the customer is an infrastructure challenge. And I guess as geothermal, we need to be much more in the ears and in the hearts and minds of our policymakers and tell the story how geothermal can benefit not only affordability and hence cheap energy sovereignty when it comes down to not someone else, blocking our infrastructure, but also about how to reach the customer all the way to the front door in order to get away from gas and get in our sourceable heat. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I see there's a lot of points on essentially geothermal communication, which is the next theme I kind of wanted to move on to. And Poppy, if I've got a question for you. So, who are the decision makers? How do we communicate with them?
Yeah, thank you, Simran, and also to echo the others, thank you to Wing for inviting me to speak on this panel. So in terms of who are the decision makers, within the UK, there's kind of a raft of different ones depending on which level you're looking at. So there's the ministers who are responsible for their policy area, and of relevance for geothermal is Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So we've got Ed Miliband as Secretary of State for that, who has overall responsibility for that department. And then below him, we've got Michael Shanks, who's the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Energy. And so he's responsible for GB Energy and also renewables in the whole. Then we've also got all of our elected MPs who are really important for raising issues in Parliament, questioning ministers and influencing policies. With respects to deep geothermal in particular, at my organisation, we've done a lot to try and target the ones where there is highest potential for geothermal in their constituency and potentially have the most to gain. And with them, it's really about highlighting what are the local benefits to their constituency, particularly in terms of jobs and local economy. One of the MPs we've got to work most with that I'm sure everyone in industry will know in the UK is Dr. Kieran Mullen. He's probably the most engaged MP on deep geothermal and has done the most to promote it, amongst other MPs as well. Then below that, we've also got civil servants who advise on policy and implementation. There's a small number within Westminster that work on geothermal, but all those that I've met have a lot of knowledge and are very specialised in their field. And we engage with them through consultation responses and meetings, but often they require kind of the more detailed, in-depth technical and policy advice in comparison to ministers and MPs. And then also we've got local government councils and combined authorities who are also important to engage with. And then from kind of a trade association perspective, the way we engage with a lot of these decision makers and kind of push geothermal up the agenda is largely similar. So we write to them and send them briefings on the topic. We invite them to conferences, host industry events, try to arrange meetings, particularly with ministers, but this can be quite hard as they're often short on time. And also like engage in roundtables, which are often a combination of industry and government. And also try to arrange site visits for MPs in particular, so they can kind of see the technology working in real life and kind of hear from industry themselves. There's also a role in terms of like getting MPs to raise parliamentary questions with MPs and in PMQs. And so, for instance, in July this year, not long after the new government came in, Dr. Kieran Mullen, who's chair of our APPG, asked Ed Miliband for a meeting with our organisation in the APPG to discuss Deep Geo. And Ed was actually very responsive to that and has agreed to at some point come to a meeting as well. And in the past, throughout like our organisation's work, we've often got MPs to try and raise PMQs. There's also a role of social media and promoting geothermal through that. And I think it's kind of just important to say to like engage across kind of the political spectrum and with loads of different stakeholders, obviously ministers and MPs, but also critically with civil servants who are really developing the kind of nitty gritty heat policy as we speak.
But that's really a wide range of ways of organisation. But I just wanted to touch more on the APPG. So what are the aims and objectives of the APPG, and how do they impact?
Yeah, sure. So an APPG, for all those that don't know, is an all-party parliamentary group, which is kind of an informal cross-party group that focuses around a particular issue or topic, and they can be on a whole raft of things. So we are the secretariat and helped set one up on deep geothermal that has Kieran Mullen as our chair. As well as other MPs that are members of that, and we've had a lot of industry support to help run the APPG and also to provide input and onto that. So the APPG's long-term goal is for geothermal to become a mainstream renewable energy source in the UK. And kind of the establishment of an APPG on geothermal is kind of a significant step towards achieving that, as it brings together parliamentarians from across the political spectrum to share information and ideas, and to also try and get them to work collaboratively with industry and like other stakeholders to really understand the sector and push for it. Its medium-term goal is to secure a geothermal strategy that sets out national targets for heat and power and the policies that would enable industry to deliver these targets. And then in the short term, on a very day-to-day, it's largely about increasing knowledge of UK geothermal potential at both government and local authority level, and to kind of encourage the government to acknowledge the need to develop clear routes to market through reforms to various like policy schemes or by introducing new schemes. Kind of it's influencing it by kind of really getting geothermal on the map. And particularly as I said before, with like PMQs and getting other MPs interested to really kind of push it up the agenda in politics. So we try and focus like our advocacy efforts on promoting the benefits of geothermal as a driver for economic growth and its ability to support government deliverables such as job creation and net zero. The group is really emphasising geothermal's ability to create jobs and support local communities, particularly in areas of like former oil and gas, and encouraging that transition to net zero as well.
Thank you, Poppy. Yeah, so you mentioned that Kieran Mullen is the leader of that group, and he is indeed a local MP. And I've just realised that Dr. Charlotte Adams has joined the call, and Charlotte is CEO of the National Geothermal Centre. So I've got a question for you, Charlotte, based on local MPs and how how they can actually bring about change in their government and affect things in their constituency.
Thanks, Simran, and hi everyone, and apologies for joining late. I messed up my timing spectacularly somehow today, so I do apologise. I can give an example of how I've worked with MPs. So when I was at Durham University, before I joined the centre, I worked with my local MP, who was Helen Goodman at the time. She's now a professor in practice with the Durham Energy Institute. And so I went to talk to her about the geothermal opportunities within her constituency. And she was really interested in that and really kind of bought into the idea. So then she was able to table a debate in Westminster on geothermal, which was brilliant. And asking the question about, you know, why weren't we doing it? What would we need to do to make it happen? So that's one example. So I think by engaging with your local MP, we now have another MP in place following the recent election, and we've done the same. We've been and spoken to him, and he wasn't aware of the extensive potential, although he had been looking at it. He knew there was some within his area and his constituency, but we were able to share information on how it works and the different ways in which geothermal could be deployed. So I think it's very valuable if you are working in geothermal to definitely talk with your local MP and also make them aware of the PPG that they could get involved with as well. And then encourage them to do things such as take debates to Westminster, because that did work really well for us. We've also engaged previously with the House of Lords slightly differently, but we're inviting them to an event we were doing a few years ago. And we invited several members of the House of Lords. One of them couldn't come, but said, please come and brief us on geothermal and other energy themes, which we did. And that led to us getting involved in the infrastructure bid at the time and suggesting an amendment to that, which actually favoured the case for geothermal development as well. So those are a few examples of how you can engage, which I hope are useful to people.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to Marit and have a bit of a contrast on how the progress in Europe has gone.
Sorry, Simran, I couldn't hear your question. Progress in Europe, and then?
Yeah, in terms of government action, decision making, how has that gone, and what can we learn?
Yeah. Well, I guess in Europe, what you see is that the individual members are doing a lot, right, around their individual jurisdictions in terms of getting out of fossil fuels and getting a form of renewable energy in. And if you look at Europe as a whole, let's say the 27 member states that are there, they're governed through, let's say, the European Commission, where you see, and I often hear this, and I still hear it as well within this webinar, is that when you're speaking to your local MPs, or when you're speaking to the European Commissioner, or when you're speaking to, in my case, also ministers of energy, who are voted in every 4 years, and you come again in a country, and after 4 years, there is a new minister of energy, and all of a sudden you have to explain again what geothermal energy is. We're not a consistent factor in the decarbonization policy making. And it tells you that that's the same, let's say, challenge that probably the UK has, that Europe has, and that a lot of individual countries have as well, in terms of influencing their respective policies and hence their government officials in terms of allowing geothermal to happen in their respective jurisdictions, whether it is for power or for heating and cooling, by the way, because that is, for us, very distinctive. But if you look at policy making, we should just argue that geothermal offers a decarbonized source of energy, right? I think that is what the common thread in our theme is, whether we deal with the market, electricity market, or the heating and cooling market. What I think works really well in Europe is that there is a collective, let's say, signature behind the pledge that says we want to triple up and we want to double down. And Europe is not alone in this. There are 138 countries that have signed at COP28 that we want to triple up and double down. Now, triple up with regards to allowing a triple up renewable energy to take place in the coming decade, preferably by 2030, to also align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Let's be honest, we have to keep an eye on achieving those as well. And double down is efficiency, right? We have to reduce our consumption of energy and thereby, of course, saving on the CO2 emissions as well. And what we're trying to do, and I think this is also where we reach out to many of our partners, not just our industry partners, but also our country partners, is to allow geothermal to play in that sandbox, right? Because we play a role in the triple up and we play a role in the double down, regardless of whether we're dealing with electricity markets or the thermal consumption in energy. Because look, for every ground source heat pump or thermal energy network or district heating network that is installed, it allows, let's say, less electricity to be used and hence less fossil fuel to be generated in order to convert first to electricity in order to heat up homes or cool down greenhouses. And hence, it is important, I think, that we are aligning around how we advocate, but also about how our messaging sits with what has already worked well for the governments to pledge to, but also to play into their tune in terms of understanding from which sheet they sing, so to speak. And I guess the alignment around influencing politicians and politics and hence policy shapers all comes down from sending a unified message. So for me, it's not just the EU. For me, of course, as a global organization, we're doing this in every continent. And fair enough, not every continent is at the same space and is in the same space or at the same pace as what the EU is doing. But equally, we collectively think that the policy playbook is around triple up, double down, and we believe fundamentally with our partners and members that geothermal plays a phenomenal role in both of these policy making.
Thank you, Marit. Yeah, it's nice to see that opinion on policy, not only in Europe but on the. So let's move on to data and evidence. So how, what type of physical pieces of research and evidence do we create for geothermal? And Jordan, I have a question for you on this. So there has been something called a white paper come out on deep geothermal technologies. So I'd like to ask you what this is and how it affects government policy.
Okay, yeah. So a white paper is an in-depth report on a specific topic. So they can cover when a government wants to know a pressing question, but they have insufficient evidence or information to make informed decisions. They'll reach out and request the answer get answered and backed up by some good data. So I work at Arup, and Arup have completed a number of white papers over the last few years, and a couple for geothermal. Mm-hmm. And from this experience, we find that they typically require some of the following, which is engagement from stakeholders. So we'll get a list of stakeholders, and then this should be as diverse as possible. So including developers, academics, policymakers, etc. But also very targeted. So we're only targeting the individuals or companies that are the most informed to give the best information. This stakeholder exercise, it should be complemented with a general literature review, and this literature review and stakeholder exercise should not be limited just to the UK, because as mentioned, other nations are further ahead in the geothermal development area. So we need to take the lessons learned from them, and we need to get their opinion and see how we can apply them to our decision making terms. And ultimately, we're going to create an information database, and this should be sufficient to provide a well-rounded argument to how select parameters were used in any models or solutions were derived. And then once you've got this database, then you can start to interrogate the answer, and this answer, the question for their answer might be, they might be seeking the opinion of a community. So, for example, the UK geothermal community, they might want to identify a few pressing issues, development handbrakes, etc. So I think the Northeast Local Enterprise Partnership White Paper released a year and a half ago. That's quite a good example of that one, where the UK geothermal industry came together and they answered a set of questions, had some workshops, and identified what were the key pressing issues which could be taken directly to the decision makers and used to inform their focused efforts. They could also look to answer, you know, where's the national resources and where should we as government or local partnerships invest our focus efforts. So, you know, we did a paper in the Northern Ireland geothermal white paper again about 2 years ago, and this identified the resources there and outlined which the technologies were suitable for, be it shallow or where is deep suitable for, where's the best area, etc. And finally, you know, they might look to revise or create financial benchmarks to inform industry and policymakers for given technologies. So, you know, I'm currently working on the UK levelised cost model for geothermal heat and power, and this is exactly what DESNZ have asked us to do. You know, they didn't have sufficient data to make informed decisions, you know, which technology to invest in, which technology needs funding mechanism support. So we've come together and got stakeholder engagement, curated that data, and hopefully we're going to deliver a report which is sufficient to inform those good decision making.
That's great. It looks like there's been a lot of good work in terms of compiling all these different data and resources. And I just wanted to move to Poppy again on, you know, how the government uses this data in reality, and is it what they actually need to enact change?
Yeah, for sure. I think everything Jordan outlined is definitely what government needs, but probably particularly what civil servants who will be implementing the policy and know deep down how everything works. That's what they really need. Government MPs also need that, but explained at a much higher level that is simpler to understand and really touching on the real tangible benefits that it will have to the country in terms of jobs and economy, its contribution to the UK's net zero goals. I think one of the things we've come across, particular with our APPG and the MPs that work on that, is that they really want evidence of costs and how those are going to come down over time. So in the same way that wind and solar as renewables their costs have come down over time, they want the same evidence that will happen for geothermal. And hopefully we can also look to Europe to show how that has happened as well, as they're obviously much further ahead of us on that front. I think they also really like industry speaking with one voice. So that's where organisations like the National Geothermal Centre that Charlotte heads up and the APPG and kind of trade associations in general can really play a role in gathering industry and various other stakeholders' voices together to kind of be calling for those same asks. We've often found in the past when industry speaks with loads of disparate voices all calling for different things, then government doesn't really listen to that. So it's important to all be kind of on the same page as that, and maybe try and work out real blueprints for how a policy scheme and support mechanism might work in the UK and how the government could apply that, as we found that's often very successful in the past when you basically write it all out already for them.
That's a really thank you, Poppy. That's a really interesting point on how you have a bunch of segregated multiple groups trying to bang their ideas at the government. Whereas, now we have something called the National Geothermal Centre, and Charlotte, I'd like to invite you to discuss, you know, what it is and what the key aims and objectives are.
Thank you. Yes, the National Geothermal Centre was established in January this year, and I joined it in April. And so far, we launched the centre in June. And we had around about 120 people at the launch, which was good because some of our attendance was restricted by the election. And at the launch, we basically described some more information about the centre, and we have a website set up and we're on LinkedIn as well. But basically the centre has been established as a not-for-profit entity with the aim of providing a voice for geothermal in the UK in order to supercharge the uptake of geothermal across the UK, and also to make it an important part of the energy mix. And I completely agree with Marit's point before. Geothermal has not been a kind of consistent option, and I think in the UK we've had a lot of people doing a lot of great work over the years, and I think to have a centre where that activity can be pulled together, people working in the sector can tell us what their asks are, and we can take those forward and we can identify their needs and, you know, undertake pieces of work to address those needs and gaps that are identified. At the moment, the centre is looking for funding. So we would like to become a through funding organisation. So we'd like to try and access government funding to allow us to operate as a through funder. So we would get some funding to grow the centre, because at the moment there's just a couple of staff working for it. And then a lot of the funding we receive, we would like to pass on to others to do some of those work around the areas that we identify through conversations with our stakeholders. And those kind of areas tend to fit into 4 main categories. So that kind of reflects the conversations we've had with people before. There's kind of policy and regulation, there's infrastructure. So things like integrating other renewable energy sources with geothermal, or integrating geothermal with heat networks, for example. There's also knowledge. So working with the 20 or so academics, academic institutions that are undertaking geothermal. And there's also a technology aspect to that as well. So looking at new technologies or improving technology. Obviously, geothermal is technology ready, but work that could be done, for example, to reduce drilling times could then obviously affect cost, reduce costs, and allow more projects to happen more efficiently. So at the launch, we announced our targets for 10 megawatts of geothermal heat by 2050, and that was 10 gigawatts of geothermal heat by 2050, 1.5 gigawatts of geothermal electricity, and that would avoid 10 million tonnes of CO2 emissions per year. We estimate that that would create between 5 and 10 jobs per megawatt of installed capacity, based on previous studies and information that was in the white paper that we've been talking about before. So we've announced those targets. The next step for us is to produce a roadmap, which we're working on, and we'll be able to share at the JOLSOC conference, which is happening in November in the UK. So we'll present the roadmap of how we plan to get there, very much as a consultation exercise. The roadmap will be divided under those 4 theme areas that I mentioned previously, and just things that we think, the steps we need to take at different points along the timeline between now and 2050 to get there. I think we also need to make a plan so that if suddenly there was a big government change in investment in geothermal, we would know where we would start and what we'd do. So that's something else we want to do and consult with people on. And I think also we need a decision-making tool. So we're aware of some larger single energy users, maybe such as hospitals and things, that are getting approached by people who are offering different types of geothermal deployment. So would you do geothermal with a heat pump? Would you have a doublet? Would you have a single well? Would you do deeper geothermal and go for heat only without a heat pump? And I think we need to have a decision-making tool. And that's something we're also going to work on at the JOLSOC conference in November. And we will share it afterwards. So we're going to workshop around the kind of attributes of the different geothermal deployments and, you know, what you would do in each case. So that's a flavour of what we're doing. We have a website, and if anybody wants any more detail, please do get in touch. We would like to support you where possible with anything you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so a lot of initiatives that all kind of hint on some of the challenges that geothermal facing, and that leads me to my next question, which is open for everyone to sort of comment on, which is, what do we all envision the main obstacles are for getting geothermal on the government agenda?
I can start.
Thank you, Jordan.
It's okay. So yeah, as I previously mentioned, you know, the government has got some short-term commitments which they need to address, and hence the focus on those larger scale renewable power generating technologies, solar and wind. There needs to be a shift in focus to more longer term goals. So I like the idea that, you know, Charlotte and the National Geothermal Centre are focusing on 2050 goals. because that's where geothermal really has an opportunity to develop and benefit from those developed supply chain investment and reductions in levelized costs. As a community, as a group, we need to put forward, strong proposals which include research and innovation, sharing of findings, etc. And hopefully, these can unlock some funding mechanisms, such as funding from UK Research and Innovation, UKRI. And ultimately, it comes down to the risk profiles. So we as practitioners need to kind of convey the risk profiles. Obviously, shallow systems are relatively low risk, and we can communicate that effectively and get those decision-making and conversations earlier in the doors. But deep geothermal remains a bit higher risk. It's got that chicken and egg scenario. So, yeah, ideally it would be great to get government support to fund a first well of a deep geothermal doublet, and then hopefully that could promote private equity financing for the remaining development of that project. But it needs that initial push, and it kind of needs a leap of faith from the government at this stage. But we as practitioners need to kind of push that agenda and hopefully get that message across the door.
Yeah, of course, and the development of United Downs is also one step in getting over obstacles, as it will be coming online next year. Yes, do we have any comment from you? Mentioned a few of these, but what do you think is the key obstacle at the moment?
Sorry, was that to me, Simran? It just dropped out a little bit there.
Oh yes, so yeah, to you, Charlotte.
Sorry, yeah. It just dropped out when you said the name. That was all. Yeah, so I think obviously we've got risk. Upfront cost and risk is a challenge. And if you look at the countries that have similar resources to the UK that have progressed further, such as the Netherlands and Germany and France, for example, they have things such as a state-backed insurance scheme and also an incentive kind of payment for heat, and open access to data. And in the UK, we have access to some data, although it is a bit piecemeal and not all of it is open or free to use. We don't have a state-backed risk insurance scheme, and the renewable heat incentive that we did have, which did help the UK's largest geothermal project at Gateshead, that helped that to be economic. We don't have that anymore. So I've been thinking about ways in which we could make geothermal lower risk in the meantime, until we can hopefully work towards getting some of those measures or something similar back that would support geothermal and promote investment. So things like you could do a single well. You could set out to start drilling a single well that you would maybe think about completing as a closed loop pipe in pipe type system. But on drilling that, when you get to the target, if you think the target is good and you're getting good results from the drilling, then you could extend that project and turn it into a doublet. If you don't get what you might need for a doublet, i.e. the water flows at depth at an adequate temperature, then you could complete that as a single well borehole. Admittedly, the heat output would be probably an order of magnitude lower than if it was an open loop doublet, but the well is not wasted and it could be still used and still provide a valuable amount of energy to an adjacent user. So I think by thinking about where you do the drilling and thinking about ways in which you can increase the risk profile as you know more, as you do more drilling, is maybe a way we can help de-risk and overcome some of the challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's really something that many people in the industry are working on. The key is how do we communicate this to the public and to government and to people who are wanting to undertake these projects in the future but are unsure. Marit, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, sure. And also offer maybe another perspective, because I do agree absolutely 100% with both Jordan and Charlotte. I mean, that is absolutely 100% true. And at the same time, looking from a global perspective, and also in my role, of course, being a more global oriented organization, I see a couple of real pain points of geothermal. And that's not our awesome technology and all the challenges and our upfront risk and high capex. I get all that, and we need to overcome all those hurdles as well. But I also see some more pertinent problems, and that is, for instance, and this is not to bash my friends at the International Renewable Energy Agency, so don't feel offended, but IRENA, for instance, who is a very strong partner to us as IGA, even has a global geothermal alliance under their wings, is informing the world on the status of renewable energy and is constantly still referring to geothermal as other. Even in their latest report on jobs, on the amount of people working, and thanks, Charlotte, for bringing in the 8 to 10 jobs per megawatt, because this is exactly what we do. We have around 8 to 10 jobs per megawatt installed. And even there, in their latest report, geothermal is omitted. And we are, at the moment, 250,000 professionals strong. That's not small anymore, right? I mean, I understand that compared to the 1 to 6 million that is overall active within the solar and wind industry, we are still minute. But if you really look at our workforce, we are with 250,000 folks out there. So why would you omit that in these leading reports that are informing governments all around the world what the state of play is? And if I cross to the IEA, another good friend of ours, of course, and hopefully by the end of November, there will be a phenomenal future of geothermal report out. And I really hope that that will help to influence the policies that are needed in order to enable the investment that we need for geothermal. But even IEA, in the past at least, have expressed their opinion on geothermal as being a flatliner. And that is not helping us. So these leading agents and agencies and analysts and that are informing not just the government officials, but also the industry leaders on renewables, on the state of energy, if you like, they should take us more serious than we currently do. And again, there's a role for us to be more bold and to be more active and to be more proactive. I take that upon ourselves as well. But equally, we need to be given the same airtime when we talk about media. We need to have the same space when we talk about renewable energy reports. And we certainly deserve to be mentioned as the category that we are, and that's called geothermal.
Thank you. Charlotte, yeah, do you have a take on this, especially with some of the challenges or the considerations for geothermal systems in the public and government and people not, you know, maybe they flatline geothermal as Marit, but maybe they do this as something that they don't really consider enough.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Marit's just said, basically. And I think, you know, you do get fed up of seeing it as other, or a new report comes out on energy policy and you quickly, the first thing you're doing is doing Control F to search for the word geothermal, and it's just not in there, and you're just like heartbroken, or it's maybe got one mention and there's not much more about it. I think we have had a bit of a battle to initially stop people. Well, I think initially discussions on renewables were all about electricity to start with. So heat was never addressed for a long time. Heat now is on people's radars. And on the geothermal track, the early discussions on the applicability of geothermal for the UK was also about electricity production, whereas its resource profile is much better suited to heat production, as we all know now. And we've made a lot of success in the UK in decarbonising our electricity supply, but we haven't. Heat is still a challenge that needs to be addressed. And with recent announcements on the creation of British Energy, it's important that heat is in there, and the government's, you know, 5 new missions, one of those which has an energy theme. It's important that geothermal and heat is in there. I think there's an aim to, every time there's an announcement made, I'm trying to reframe geothermal to think how it can contribute to that policy option or technology that's being funded. So, for example, you know, the mission to produce clean electricity by 2030, we could reduce the amount that needed to be greened if we used geothermal to take the stress off the electricity network by using geothermal and heat pumps, or geothermal directly for heating. We could remove some of that stress on the grid and reduce the amount you have to green. Similarly, with recent support for CCS, geothermal has a really important role in places where you can't do CCS. And those 10 million tonnes that we would avoid annually in 2050 by having that geothermal target in place would offset CCS costs of being between 0.8 and 1.2 billion pounds. So it's trying to get it onto people's radar and show them the impact that it could have, and the fact that it's versatile across a range of scales and applications, which not many other low carbon energy sources are. And there's also other opportunities with it, such as the recovery of critical minerals, or using it for heating and cooling, and also for energy storage. So we've got a lot to do to prove and demonstrate its value.
Yeah, of course, there are very important synergies that will hopefully will come about in the future. Combining with different technologies, etc. Okay, so thank you. Finally, before we go to a few questions, I'd like to invite all the panelists to answer the question of, how can individuals, as well as, some organizations, take both local and national levels to support and promote geothermal energy? What can they do? What can you do as
maybe just to jump in first, although obvious one, write/speak to your local MP or local councillor. I would say to not underestimate the power of the individual, because as Kieran Mullen, who's now probably the strongest MP advocate for geothermal, always likes to say, that's how he first got interested in it, because a member of his constituency just stopped him on the street to talk about it. So I'd say that's a really important and easy thing to do.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in next. Yeah, education and discussion, in the industry, you need to educate local councils and developers. Far too frequently, we see that ground source heat pumps or deep geothermal are discounted from a short list of energy solutions, either because they haven't been thought of, hadn't had the time to review the assessments, or they're approached too late, at which time the timescales for development are too short. So yeah, just get it on people's radars and mention it at an early stage in any project development.
Thank you, Jordan. Okay, great. Excellent. That brings to a close our sort of themes and questions. Now I'd like to kind of I'll get a few questions from the chat. So I can see 2 questions come up. So one from Michael. And I think I'm going to take one, because I think so. It says, how can individuals support geothermal development in the UK beyond emailing MPs, telling friends, and connected? Okay, yeah. Let's go with that one. That might be a bit more of a thinking question for everyone. Marit, do you have any opinions on how people can go that extra step further?
As in the UK or in general?
I think in general, apart from sort of contacting your local MP and telling friends and spreading word.
Yeah, well, I think, look, biased as I am, I think when you're a professional, join an association. And I'm not saying this because of IGA. I'm saying this because the voice of the many is better to channel it through a association. So if you happen to have a national center, like Charlotte is now heading, or if you have a Poppy, like a leading in a voice around an association that is targeting the right channels to influence, I would definitely recommend each and everyone to join that association. Monetary wise, it's always helpful, but also voice wise, because it's often overlooked how important the individual voice is. Otherwise, it is just Poppy or Charlotte or Marit or Jordan who is trying to influence. And it is easier when you have more people chipping in and voicing out their observations, their interests, their perceptions, but also how their ideas. I mean, we're stronger together. And I think each and every one reaching out to their MPs, yeah, also great, but also help Poppy to reach out or help Charlotte to reach out, right? So that would be my number one tip. If you're a layman or if you are, let's say, just interested in geothermal, what I see is happening worldwide, and this is just fantastic to see, is that more and more people take up voluntary roles at schools and to help educate and to help teach and to bring up packages for, let's say, the teachers, so that they have a better understanding of how to explain to their kids at school what the benefits are of not just geothermal, but I guess in general renewable energy, but then also how geothermal fits in that bigger picture. And I think at a certain moment in life, we have all been or will be parents, we are daughters, we are nieces, we are sisters, we are brothers, we have family members, right? I mean, we're part of a bigger thing. And hence, do not underestimate the power of reaching out and helping and speaking and voicing out your interests, your hobbies and your passions to your neighbors, to your family members, to your kids, to your grandma. And I guess that is something that I think we are so convinced internally within geothermal. We are so convinced that we think others are as well, but they're not. We are with 250,000 people. The world consists of 8 billion. And let me be very fair, in 7 years in this role, 8 billion people are not convinced yet that geothermal is the choice. And hence, the more we speak about this with non-believers, the better it is.
No, very, very important. And I agree. It feels like I'm in my own bubble sometimes. Yeah, things to take on. Great, thank you. So we have a question from Rebecca. So following on from Jordan's point, as we strive to innovate and overcome the challenges of exploitation, e.g. drilling versus depth costs, how can academic institutions effectively lobby for increased support and funding to drive research and development in the sector? What are the initiatives or partnerships what specific initiatives and partnerships should they pursue to enhance their impact on the industry?
I'll jump in there. So yeah, obviously the deep drilling cost is the obvious high risk item, and you can only get so far with 2D seismics, 3D seismics before you have to drill that deep well and just see what you get out of the ground. There's going to be an inherent level of risk until that point. I think as a community with academics, etc., industry, we have a source of data. We collectively should know where some of the best deep geothermal targets are. Because of this, the nature of the UK industry at the moment, the next well needs to kind of be as successful as possible. So we should be focusing our efforts on the highest opportunity areas, but also pair that with obvious social benefits. So we need to ensure that these wells aren't isolated. They need to have that direct heat user or cooling user if it's a shallow system, to demonstrate to the government that we're delivering social benefits. And it's not just developers making money. It's driving change. It's delivering social good, and it's all based on sound science. So I think that's where we can inform decisions from that side.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I'm aware there's so many questions, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our time. So maybe there'll be an opportunity at a future event to come across one of our panelists and pick their brains on what they have to say about geothermal and the government. Now I'd just like to thank our panelists for having such an interesting discussion on quite an important topic, given Labour government coming in, and we'll see what the future has in store. Hopefully a lot of action in the coming years. I'd just like to head back to Hester to close the meeting. Oh, actually, no, I'd like to mention that everyone should, if they're not already subscribed to Wing, or Dutch, they should do that. We have an emailing list, and please get that. Please get your emails to us. the updates out yet. Rebecca's put something in the chat for that. Yep.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
great.
much.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much to
everyone.
Simran and the panel. And we'll now say goodbye. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating, Simran. Well done. Thank you, Hester.
No
Ciao.
worries.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.